Hello and welcome to the second lecture on Georgi Derluguian's book Bourdieu's Secret Admirer in the Caucasus, a World Systems Biography. In this lecture I want to talk about chapters 3 through 5, and I think it's only right, given the title of the book, that we talk a little bit about Pierre Bourdieu, whom I expect most of you will have realized is a French sociologist, very famous sociologist. He died in 2002, and he's famous for a series of key concepts. Very briefly, since one cannot summarize all of these concepts in one lecture, let me just briefly mention some of them. First of all, the concept of a field, which is a title, of course, of one of the chapters in this book. That is a concept which is deliberately used in opposition to society, and it gives the sense that any particular domain, any particular social unit is determined by the play of different actors, and those actors are not simply classes in a kind of Marxist sense. There's a great fluidity, and what one needs to study are various types of capital. And so he takes this notion, which is central to sociology, and he complexifies it. He talks about economic capital, which is a kind of standard understanding and Marxist understanding of it as money, as that which the business class has. But then he broadens it to talk about cultural capital, the importance of the qualifications, the skills, the competencies, the educational diplomas and the like, which a professional class acquire in the process of their education and socialization. And this is a means of distinguishing groups from each other. So it's not simply on the basis of access to the mode of production or relationship to the mode of production. It has to do with cultural capital too. Another distinction is social capital, the particular memberships, these networks that one is a part of. And these may be anything from church groups to the Masons to ethnic groups, to coming from a certain place, being part of a certain tribe. And these are extremely important because they're ways of making one's place and developing a particular position within the social field. And they're extremely important when there is a social crisis, or they're extremely important in trying to break into employment, for example, or to engage in enterprise of some type or other. The fourth type of capital that is also important is symbolic capital, and this is the capital that comes from recognition, and it is the particular legitimacy that comes from a certain achievement. Now, in part, this can be like a church leader or a cardinal who has symbolic capital by virtue of his position, supposed moral authority. In this context, it is significant when we talk about artists and novelists and poets and those engaged in cultural production and performances, theatre and the like. These are people who are outside of a purely materialistic economy, and they gain prestige because of of their cultural productions, because of the fact that they express the national soul, or they are a call to conscience. It also involves filmmakers and the like. And what you often have in society are people who have high symbolic capital. They're looked to as role models, but they actually may have very little economic capital. They may not necessarily be very rich at all, and in some instances these things are directly related to each other. So in the case of the Soviet Union, the dissidents, the Solzhenitsyns and others, are looked upon as having high symbolic capital, even though they are marginalized in the society as a whole, because they're seen as having legitimacy, they're seen as speaking the truth. Now, another concept that one finds in Bourdieu's book, and that Derluguian uses, is the term habitus. And it refers to, as I have defined it here, a set of dispositions, reflexes and forms of behaviour people acquire through acting in society. It can be termed lifestyle, a way of living, a way of making sense of the world. So there's a sort of a cultural set of practices that one learns from childhood. And in many instances, these have a tremendously unconscious quality about them. The way one eats one's food, the way one carries oneself in a social situation, the ability to speak in public, all of these things reflect a habitus. And obviously different classes have different habituses which are constantly observable by other social groups. So it's these particular types of patterns and behaviours which Bourdieu was interested in. Okay, so let's talk about trajectories of Soviet developmentalism. And I want to refer you to page 330, table 6, where there is a nice breakdown of the historical trajectory of Soviet developmentalism. We will begin with a brief discussion of coercive developmentalism, the period that Stalin ruled from 1929 to his death in 1953. And this is discussed in chapter 3. He refers to it as terrorist centralization. The main organ of oppression here is the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the MVD, which had as one branch of it what became the KGB. And Beria was the leader of that, as you should know by now. Now, this particular form of developmentalism is very nicely summarized in this section, Possibility, at the end of the book. So the section from page 290 onwards. And this section he's trying to explore the question of whether there was a possibility for democracy in the Soviet developmentalist state, and moments in which one could have had democracy. And he makes the argument that the architecture of the Soviet state was determined in the main by three institutions that had mostly contributed to the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War. This is page 295. The first of these is the centralized and all-encompassing nomenclatura system of political bureaucratic appointment. The second one was the forced mobilization of economic resources and manpower for the war effort. And thirdly was the establishment of the national republics. And he then writes, Stalinism flowed directly from the institutions, policies and cadres forged in the Russian Civil War. And that's a very important point, and it gets at the ways in which the particular practices of warfare, the circumstances of warfare, the brutalizations, and the trigger of that civil war, which is of course the revolution itself, that brings us back to practices in the Tsarist state, and it brings us back to the attraction to a high modernism on the part of Lenin and Stalin as a break from Tsarist practice. But it is a form of break which is extremely authoritarian, just like the Tsarist system. And he discusses the war economic configuration of the Soviet state. its antagonistic relation to the peasantry, and then the hostile geopolitical context. Now, the sort of middle range nomenclatura of the Stalinist state, this coercive developmentalism, by and large were quite poorly educated. They did have some training, and they had certainly lots of indoctrination, but and in many instances the way to advance within that bureaucracy was to show ideological zeal, to be extremely rigid, to be extremely ambitious in pushing this kind of high modernist coercive developmentalism, and to be extremely loyal. But as lots of loyal communists found out to their cost, they could be extremely loyal and even zealous in their pursuit of their jobs, and still be subject to arbitrary arrest, to deportation, and even to murder and disposal. The Great Terror had an arbitrary quality about it. It was a bureaucratic terror, and but nevertheless it was also an ad hoc one. It was one that was a function of the particular bureaucratic whims of Stalin, but there was, as Derluguian makes the case in this section, it also had to do with the particular context itself. And he argues, and this is again page 295, to restate it as a positive theoretical proposition, the purges in the personality cult did not grow out of Stalin's head, but rather from the newly achieved centralization of political, military, economic, and ideological structures. Historically, such a degree of centralization has in turn produced its charismatic embodiment in the great hero-villain figures such as Napoleon in one situation, or Ataturk, Mussolini, Perón, Mao, on and on and on. And these are all sort of developmentalist states. And so what he's arguing here is what we're looking at in the case of the Soviet Union is not simply uniquely a communist experience. This has to do with the larger situating of developmentalist states within a capitalist world economy, and the attempt by these states to try to catch up with core capitalist Western states. Now, living under Stalinism was, of course, a very, very dangerous thing. It was a very nervous condition. It was one that lent itself to instability, because the bureaucracy did not necessarily function in a coolly rational way, and there was no predicting how it actually, force and terror would be used, and that created great anxiety and instability within the communist cadre. With the death of Stalin in his bed, one moves to the rule eventually of Khrushchev as a figure leading de-Stalinization, denouncing Stalin in a secret speech in 1956, and beginning the normalization of what can be described as a progressive developmentalism, in the sense that this was a period in the 50s and in the 60s when the Soviet Union really saw itself still as a vanguard power, still as a power which was going to bury the West. It was going to surpass it because of its modernist achievements, its achievements in science, its achievements in agricultural production, in industrialization, in shipbuilding, in armaments, etc., etc. So there's still a belief that this was a project that could remake humanity, and it was seen as the future. And so it's important to kind of grasp that, because he makes the argument in chapter 3 on the dynamics of de-Stalinization. Why did state socialism outlive Stalinism? And he argues it outlived it because there was a genuine hegemony. The egalitarian communist ideology retained its hegemony in its purest Gramscian sense, or rather, the hegemony of communist ideas was mightily bolstered by the processes of de-Stalinization, both from above, as Khrushchev struggled to restore Leninist norms, and from below by the masses, who enthusiastically embraced the promise of unending progress and a much better life on the horizon. And things were getting better after the decade after the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, for most Soviet citizens. And so it's important to grasp that there were, by and large, the majority of the population were believers. Now, this reclaiming of legitimacy after the Stalinist period, and of course during the Stalinist period a large part of the population lived with the mythology of Stalin and only heard about the great terror through rumours and may not necessarily have been personally affected, and certainly had lots of scripts at hand to try to justify the particular disappearances that occurred during that time, the purges and the like. But in this period, what you had is the further deepening of the legitimacy of the Soviet Union by it becoming an affirmative action empire and constantly seeking to promote national, non-Russian peoples. And that leads to this cultural awakenings of various types. And here you have the Soviet state engaging in the promotion of artists, writers, and intellectuals. And with de-Stalinization, you had a thaw in the cultural sphere, and you had a greater openness to new literary forms, new productions of one type and another, and new histories, more critical histories, and then remembrances. And what these cultural workers who were engaged in this, what they did is they created, in many instances, cultural icons and cultural performances which had resonance and which legitimated the Soviet Union, but by legitimating the nation. And that association between the Soviet Union and the nation, of course, was to come asunder later, because with the rising symbolic capital of artists and intellectuals, you then ran the risk that these artists and intellectuals, that intelligentsia, might get out ahead of the project of the Soviet Union, and so that was always a danger. And more generally, the nomenclatura sought to try to put the brakes on the reformism that occurred under Khrushchev, and what they saw as a certain slackening and failures in the geopolitical arena. And so one had the backlash against him and the internal coup that led to Khrushchev being ousted and a new era of conservative communism. And that era was presided over by Leonid Brezhnev, who died in 1982 as a very, very old man, and in the 1970s, late 70s and 1980s, in his geriatric state, really personified the sclerosis that had crept up on the Soviet developmental state. Now, interestingly, Derluguian describes the Soviet developmentalist state as at an end. He describes it comfortable death on page 105, and it's important to grasp why he describes it in those terms. And this is how he puts it. The ruling bureaucrats had first betrayed the world revolution during Stalinism, Now their successors, quote unquote, betrayed their perceived historical role as bureaucratic modernizers. The word betray must be put in cautionary quotation marks, because although the Soviet nomenclatura proved unfaithful to the utopian project of permanent revolutionary transformation and overtaking the capitalist West, they still remain faithful to their emerging class interest. And so essentially they give up on the idea of the Soviet Union being at the vanguard, and they instead chose a form of kind of bureaucratic rule, stagnant bureaucratic rule, which actually suppressed innovation and suppressed cultural diversity and cultural debate. It was not a self-confident regime necessarily. He makes the distinction, which draws upon the work of Valery Bunce, between the yawning gap between the reach and the grasp of the state, between its institutional destiny and institutionalization. And the argument is that in actual fact what we have is a weakening of the central government at this time, and the particular aspirations of the state may have been to control as much as they could, but that aspiration reflected a decreasing legitimacy. The hegemony that the Soviet state enjoyed in the 1950s under Khrushchev was ebbing away, and there was an attempt to try to buy some degree of legitimacy through consumerism. But this consumerism was unsustainable. It was actually funded by windfall petrodollar profits from the sale of Soviet oil on the international market. What you had was an increasing repressive state during this time in order to safeguard the rule of what became permanent bureaucrats. And you had the restoration of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. You had a significant rise in the prison population, and you had also an increasing gap between the rhetoric of the Soviet Union. Was always a gap between its rhetoric and its practice, but it became a yawning gap at this time. And you had the resort to criminal activities and ways of doing things which were outside of the official norms, because that's the only way people could get by. And that, of course, was to be extremely important later on, as this sort of criminalized, comrade criminals, those types of practices became institutionalized in this period. They became embedded within the operation of the class structure, and of course they blossomed and saw the stealing of so much of the state's assets when the Soviet Union entered its period of crisis between 1989 and 1993. Now, another point that is worth mentioning at this about this period is that you had the weakening of the Kremlin's control over the national republics and the provinces as local nomenclatura embedded their power and made themselves indispensable to Moscow. You then reach a trajectory of rationalization, where the sclerosis of the Brezhnev era is apparent to everyone, where the unsustainable nature of consumerism is evident also, and you enter this period of reform, the frantic need for reform. He calls it rationalization between 1982 and 1989, beginning with Brezhnev's successor Andropov, who died quite soon after he came to power, but he nevertheless appointed Gorbachev to the Central Committee. Gorbachev, who was a competent state leader in the Communist Party official in Stavropol in the North Caucasus, and so was very familiar with that region, brought into the Politburo, and then later, after another leader dies in the meantime, becomes the new face of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and launches policies of perestroika, or industrial restructuring, along with glasnost, a kind of cultural openness, a willingness to try to reclaim legitimacy for the regime by allowing public debate on very, very sensitive issues that had been repressed, including the tremendous crimes of Stalin. Now, the goal of this was to try to save the Soviet Union through reform. It was the only strategy that they could pursue, but it was also something that was impossible because the bureaucratic nomenclatura, the vested interests were lined up against this, and it was sabotaged from the outset. And what one ended up getting was a fracturing of this nomenclatura, and the eventual defection of the mid-level nomenclatura, who became capitalists in spite of themselves, and engaged in widespread looting of the resources of the state, and setting themselves up in power in the national republics, or also locally. Now, they didn't do it easily. They had to fight against other factions that were struggling to seize power from them. And so there is, this is the particular table. You can read about the state break, the sections that come afterwards, the trajectories, state breakdown, the Yeltsin years, and then restoration from 1994. So the crisis really is 1989, when you had the end of the Cold War, on through to 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the beginning of the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, through 1994 and the Chechen War. Now, there is a whole chapter on social structure here, which is extremely important and well worth reading closely. I just simply want to note about this chapter 5, that he's really dealing with three large classes here. The nomenclatura, about 10% of the population, the proletariats, who are essentially the people who are given jobs by the state. They are the products of the state. And they can be divided into a series of different factions themselves, but they're very much dependent upon the state. Yet they cannot survive alone by the wages provided. They have to engage in all sorts of practices in the informal economy, in the grey market, in order to be able to get by, to get the kind of consumer products they need, or get make connections to get heating oil, to get books that they want, records, etc., etc., Levi jeans and the like. The real innovation, and something that I think is very valuable about this book, is discussion of a class below the proletariat, the sub-proletariat. And these are the classes that are not professional, that are not necessarily connected into the state in any formalized way. They are farmers. They are people who are engaged in their kind of lumpen proletariat, the street. They are people who are engaged in the shady grey market, and they're also a kind of unemployed urban youth, people who are kind of failing out of class, and who have as their only major skills violent entrepreneurship of one type or another. They become the mafia and the recruiting ground for a lot of the militias, who then engage in their own form of enterprise and material accumulation through ethnic cleansing and terror. Now, there is a discussion of the different factions in the table 2 at the end of the book. And as you can see, in the case of the ruling bureaucracy, he has 3 different factions that he identifies. The reform nomenclatura, the people represented by Gorbachev, the perestroika, the sort of new wave of believing in the system and believing that it can be saved in some way through reform. You had the ordinary nomenclatura, who were essentially watching what was happening and were not committing themselves to perestroika necessarily. And then you had the elite dissenters and defectors, the people like Yeltsin, Dudayev, who were previously part of the Communist Party and who broke with it in order to begin to form a post-Soviet, a post-communist system of some type or other. Their agenda was also reform, but they could also be extremely populist and often made common cause with the aspirations and rhetoric of the sub-proletariat, many of whom had served in prison and had their kind of discourse was a prison discourse, because the Russian prisons have their own kind of language, and political leaders, Putin is very, very good at this, are able to kind of mobilize that group by speaking in a certain way and speaking to their aspirations and communicating to them in a knowing way. You had then the proletarianized citizenry, and he defines it here, breaks it into state-invested intellectuals and other specialists, the professional classes, the professional and technical specialists, the intelligentsia, and then the kind of the workers generally, the kind of not necessarily highly specialized workers. The last class, the sub-proletariat, very, very significant in explaining violence and the degree to which certain circumstances led to violence. So then he discusses the different trajectories and talks about pacted transitions on page 165, and I've sort of summarized his argument here. But essentially you had a state crisis from 1989 to 1994, as you have fragmentation within the nomenclatura. You have those who are in national territorial administrative positions, and then you have those who are in sectoral positions, who are in various industries and the like. And the nomenclatura who are in charge of certain state industries are those who become capitalists. They are the people that begin the privatization, begin the asset stripping, begin the process of defecting from the communist system. And then you also had the defection of the territorial elites, worked out differently in different places. In the case of the Baltic states, the nomenclatura, by and large, saw which way the wind was blowing and joined the national intellectuals, the counter-communist elite that sought to use historical memory, the cultural awakenings that occurred in order to mobilize the population around ethnicity, around anti-communism. And the nomenclatura, in many instances, were able to effect this transition. They moved from being communists to being European social democrats. By and large, that process led to democratization, an imperfect democratization, certainly in the case of the Baltic states, which reconstituted their conception of the nation and citizenship on ethnocratic grounds, excluding Russians, and in the cases of Estonia and elsewhere, making a large part of the population stateless, but nevertheless one that involved regular elections, which weren't transparently corrupt and subverted. You had then a Central Asian and a Ukrainian path, where the nomenclatura were very deeply embedded, very strong, and they co-opted or suppressed the national intellectuals, those seeking to use nationalism to mobilize against them. And what you had was a transition as they defected from communism to a post-communist system where they still were in power, and in many instances they still believed in this sort of modernist developmentalism, only it was neo-patrimonial in that it was extremely corrupt. It was locked around the rule of a certain family, key family, and that family spread outwards through its particular networks of patronage, buying legitimacy. But that legitimacy was one which was often very, very shaky indeed, so neo-patrimonialism always had the potential for violence, was always somewhat unstable. And then you have the Caucasus path, and we've discussed that already. The nomenclatura in certain cases, like Chechnya, are completely overthrown. In other instances, they splinter. Karabindo-Balkaria, to a certain extent, represents this. Certainly in the South Caucasus, you have different examples of the nomenclatura splintering. And then you have, in some instances, the splintering leading to national intellectuals coming to power in Georgia, in Azerbaijan for a certain period, before you have then the recovery of the nomenclatura and their return, promising stability in the face of the violence and instability that was brought in by relatively incompetent leadership on the part of the anti-communist national intellectuals, Gamsakhurdia and others, Gamsakhurdia in Georgia, for example. Okay, so that is a discussion of these particular chapters. It's a very quick and dirty overview, but you can get some sense of the paths and the path dependence that he wants to begin to discuss here, and the ways in which, when we're dealing with class factions, we need to be very much aware of the degrees to which these factions can crystallize in different ways. Certain pacts, certain alliances between classes can develop. They can crystallize, they can congeal in certain ways, and then a particular historic moment passes, and then you have a new formation. Okay, I'll leave it there.